My wife mocked me in front of her friends for not having a job. They didn't know I owned the company they all worked for until I fired them. The parking spot in front of our brownstone was a miracle. Usually I'd have to circle the block 3 times before finding something decent. But there it was, right in front of the steps, like the universe was finally cutting me some slack. I should have known better. The universe doesn't hand out favors without expecting payment, and man, was I about to pay up big time. I killed the engine and sat there for a second, feeling pretty damn good about myself. The little bakery box on the passenger seat held 2 slices of that ridiculously expensive tiramisu from Benedetto's, the place where Nora and I had our first date 5 years ago. She'd ordered it that night, made this little sound of pure joy when she tasted it, and I'd been hooked. Not just on her, but on that look she got when something made her genuinely happy. These days, I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen that expression. Work had been brutal lately. Not the kind of brutal where you're drowning in deadlines or dealing with asshole clients. Hell, I wish it were that simple. No, this was the kind where you're juggling a dozen different identities, managing shell companies through encrypted emails, and making sure nobody connects the dots between the guy who signs the big checks and the guy who makes scrambled eggs every morning in his pajamas. The weight of it all had been pressing down on my shoulders like a lead blanket, and I'd figured tonight would be perfect for just being us again. Just Michael and Nora, eating overpriced Italian dessert and maybe watching one of those Netflix shows she's always trying to get me into. I grabbed the bakery box in my jacket, already picturing her face when she saw what I'd brought home. Maybe we'd open that bottle of wine we'd been saving, the one from our anniversary trip to Napa. Maybe we'd actually talk about something other than bills or whose turn it was to take out the trash. Maybe she'd laugh the way she used to, soft and genuine, like she was sharing a secret just with me. The front steps creaked under my feet. We'd been meaning to fix that for months. I fumbled with my keys, trying to balance the dessert box while working the lock that always stuck when it was humid. That's when I heard it. Laughter. But not Nora's usual laugh, the one that sounded like wind chimes on a lazy Sunday afternoon. This was different. Sharper. Theatrical. The kind of laugh you use when you're performing for an audience. My hand froze on the doorknob. Through the thin walls of our place, I could hear voices, multiple voices. Nora had company. That wasn't unusual. She'd always been more social than me. Always had friends dropping by for impromptu wine sessions or whatever it is that women do when they get together. But something about the tone, the energy coming from inside, made my stomach tighten. I pressed my ear closer to the door, feeling like a complete creep but unable to stop myself. The voices were clearer now. I recognized them. Bianca, with her fake-ass French accent that she'd picked up during a semester abroad 10 years ago. Tessa, whose voice always went up 3 octaves when she'd had a few drinks. And Harper, who laughed like she was auditioning for a sitcom. I swear, the man doesn't even have a job. Nora's voice cut through the others like a blade through silk. Clear, confident, cruel. The bakery box slipped in my hands, and I had to catch it against my chest. The cardboard felt suddenly heavy, like it was made of stone instead of Italian pastry. My heart started doing this weird stuttering thing, like it couldn't decide whether to speed up or just stop altogether. He just sits around the house all day, reading books and acting all mysterious, she continued, and I could practically hear the eye roll in her voice. Like he's some kind of misunderstood genius or something. The laughter that followed hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just Nora, it was all of them, cackling like a pack of hyenas who'd just spotted wounded prey. I could picture them in there, probably sprawled across our couch with their designer handbags and their perfectly manicured nails, dissecting my life like it was some kind of joke they'd all agreed to share. No goals, no paycheck, no ambition. Nora went on, and each word felt like a nail being driven into my chest. I mean, what kind of man just exists? My mother warned me about marrying a dreamer, but I thought he'd grow out of it. More laughter. Sharper this time. Meaner. I stood there on my own doorstep, holding dessert I'd bought for a woman who apparently thought I was the punchline to some cosmic joke, and felt something inside me shift. Not break. Breaking would have been cleaner, easier to fix. This was more like a gear clicking into place, like a machine that had been running on the wrong setting finally finding its proper configuration. They thought I was nobody. They thought I was nothing. If only they knew who was signing their paychecks. I turned that doorknob like I was defusing a bomb. Slow, deliberate, careful not to make a sound. The hinges had started squeaking last month, but I'd gotten pretty good at opening the door just right, applying pressure in exactly the right spots to keep it silent. Funny how you learn these little tricks when you spend your days moving through the world like a ghost. The scene that greeted me was exactly what I'd pictured, but somehow worse in living color. Our living room had been transformed into some kind of tribunal, with Nora holding court like she was auditioning for Real Housewives of Brooklyn. She'd positioned herself on the armrest of our couch, not sitting in it like a normal person, but perched on top like she was posing for a magazine shoot. Her legs were crossed at that perfect angle she'd practiced in college, the one that made her calves look longer and her ankles more delicate. She was wearing the white silk blouse I'd bought her in Lisbon. We'd been walking through the Chiato district, just wandering really, when she'd stopped dead in front of this little boutique window. The way she'd looked at that shirt, like it was some kind of holy relic, had made me pull out my credit card without even checking the price. €300. Worth every cent just to see her face light up. Now, watching her wear it while she tore me apart for entertainment, I wondered if she even remembered where it came from. Her audience was arranged around her like disciples at the feet of their prophet. Bianca had claimed the oversized armchair, the one we'd splurged on last Christmas because Nora said it would make the room look more sophisticated. She was holding her wine glass like it contained the secrets of the universe, swirling the red liquid with the kind of pretentious flourish that made me want to remind her that she worked in HR, not wine country. That fake French accent of hers was in full effect tonight, every other word dripping with manufactured European sophistication. Tessa had squeezed herself into the corner of the couch, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves over one shoulder. She'd always been the follower of the group, the one who laughed a beat too late and agreed with whatever opinion was already winning. Tonight she was nodding along to every word Nora said like she was taking notes for a final exam. And Harper, Jesus, Harper was something else. She'd sprawled herself across the floor cushions we'd bought for movie nights, treating our living room like her personal photo studio. Her silver heels were kicked off carelessly, and she was lying on her stomach with her chin propped up on her hands, looking up at Nora with the kind of rapt attention you'd give to a master class. My husband, the stay-at-home philosopher, Nora was saying, gesturing with her wine glass in a way that made the liquid slosh dangerously close to the rim. The sarcasm in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Always talking about potential and long-term thinking, but never actually doing anything about it. I stood in the doorway, maybe 10 feet away from them, holding that stupid bakery box like some kind of peace offering to gods who'd already decided I was unworthy. The irony wasn't lost on me. I could have bought and sold every person in that room without putting a dent in my checking account, and yet I was the one being treated like a charity case. No goals, no paycheck, Nora continued, and I watched her friends hang on every word like she was delivering the State of the Union. I mean, what kind of grown man just floats? Like, I get it, everyone needs time to figure things out, but we're 32 years old. At some point, you have to actually pick a direction and walk in it, you know? The laughter that followed was even worse than what I'd heard through the door. Up close, I could see the way their faces twisted with amusement, the way they exchanged those knowing looks that women perfect in high school and never quite grow out of. It was the kind of laughter that's designed to exclude, to create an in-group by defining exactly who doesn't belong. And apparently, I didn't belong. In my own damn house. I took a step back, then another, moving with the kind of stealth I'd learned during those late nights when I'd come home from board meetings and didn't want to wake Nora. My socks were thick enough to muffle any sound, and I'd mapped every creaky floorboard in this place during our first month here. The hallway stretched out behind me like an escape route, and I followed it toward the bedroom. The really twisted part was how invisible I felt. Not just unnoticed, actually invisible, like I was some kind of benevolent spirit haunting my own life. They were sitting in furniture I'd paid for, drinking wine I'd bought, wearing clothes purchased with money from companies I owned, and not one of them had any idea that the man they were mocking had more power over their daily lives than they could possibly imagine. I closed the bedroom door behind me with the softest click and stood there for a moment, just breathing. The room felt different now, like I was seeing it for the first time. Our bed, with its rumpled white sheets and the novel Nora had been reading splayed open on her nightstand. The dresser we'd assembled together during our first week in this place, arguing over the instructions and laughing when we put the drawer handles on upside down. The framed photo from our wedding day, both of us grinning like we'd just won the lottery. 5 years. 5 years of marriage, and she had no idea who I actually was. She'd never asked about the consulting work I claimed to do, never wondered why my schedule was so flexible or how I managed to pay for our trips and dinners and random expensive gifts. She'd just accepted the story I'd given her, that I was some kind of freelance analyst who worked with investment firms, and built her own narrative around it. A narrative where I was the failure, the deadweight, the man-child who couldn't get his act together. I sat down on the edge of the bed and listened to the muffled sounds of their conversation continuing in the living room. More laughter, more commentary on my shortcomings, more evidence that the woman I'd loved for 5 years saw me as nothing more than an elaborate disappointment. She thought I was jobless. She had no idea that I owned the company that signed all their paychecks. She never asked. And now, I had heard enough. The next morning came with that particular kind of gray light that filters through Brooklyn windows in late fall, the kind that makes everything look washed out and slightly unreal. I'd been awake since 5, lying in bed next to Nora while she slept peacefully, her breathing soft, and even like she didn't have a care in the world. Amazing how easy it is to sleep soundly when you don't know you've just torched your entire life. I'd spent those pre-dawn hours staring at the ceiling, not thinking about revenge or payback or any of that movie villain bullshit. No, I was thinking about systems, about cause and effect, about the beautiful, terrible logic of consequences finally catching up to choices. There's something almost mathematical about it when you strip away all the emotion and hurt feelings. Actions create reactions. Lies demand truth. And sometimes, the universe just needs a little help with the bookkeeping. By 6:30, I was in the kitchen doing what I'd done every morning for the past 3 years, making breakfast. Scrambled eggs, the way Nora liked them, soft and creamy, with just a touch of cream cheese folded in at the end. Fresh ground coffee from that ridiculously expensive blend she'd discovered at the farmer's market. 2 pieces of sourdough toast, lightly buttered. Orange juice in the good glasses, not the everyday ones. I'd gotten into this routine back when I was still trying to be the perfect husband, back when I thought domestic gestures might somehow fill the gap between who I was and who she wanted me to be. Turns out, making breakfast every morning doesn't transform you from unemployed loser into devoted partner. It just makes you the guy who happens to be really good at scrambled eggs. The coffee was just finishing its brew cycle when I heard her footsteps on the hardwood floor. That particular shuffle-click combination of bare feet and painted toenails that I'd learned to recognize in the dark. She appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing one of my old Columbia t-shirts and a pair of yoga pants. Her hair pulled back in that messy bun that somehow looked effortlessly perfect. Even first thing in the morning, even after spending an evening destroying my character for sport, she was still beautiful enough to stop traffic. "Morning, babe," she said, stretching up on her toes to kiss my cheek. The same kiss she'd given me yesterday morning, and the morning before that, and every morning for the past however many years. Routine. Muscle memory. The kind of affection that doesn't require thought or feeling, just repetition. I plated her eggs and slid them across the counter, along with her coffee doctored exactly the way she liked it. 2 sugars, splash of half and half. She settled onto her usual stool and immediately reached for her phone, scrolling through Instagram while she ate. Because God forbid we should have an actual conversation during breakfast. "Sleep okay?" I asked, because that's what husbands ask. That's what we're supposed to do. She murmured, not looking up from her screen. She was double-tapping photos of someone's vacation in Bali, or maybe it was Costa Rica. Hard to tell when you're watching upside down from across a kitchen counter. I sipped my coffee and watched her eat the eggs I'd made, using the fork I'd set out, sitting at the counter I'd paid for, in the apartment I'd put the down payment on. The morning light caught the ring on her finger. The engagement ring that had cost me 2 months' salary back when I was still pretending to be a normal person with a normal job. White gold band, princess-cut diamond. Exactly what she'd pointed out in the window of that jewelry store in Manhattan. "Oh," she said suddenly, looking up from her phone with the expression of someone who'd just remembered something mildly interesting. "Bianca mentioned you seemed quiet last night when she was leaving." There it was. The opening I'd been waiting for without even realizing I was waiting for it. I took another sip of coffee, letting the pause stretch out just long enough to seem natural. Did she? I said. Yeah, she said you looked a little. Nora made this vague gesture with her fork, like she was trying to pluck the right word out of the air. Lost. Like you were having one of your thinking moments. My thinking moments. As if the process of human cognition was some kind of quirky character trait, like being double-jointed or having unusually long eyelashes. As if the fact that I spent time considering the world around me was somehow evidence of personal deficiency. They all think you're a little lost, actually, she continued, and I could hear the careful tone she was using, the one that suggested she was trying to be helpful rather than hurtful. Like you're still figuring out what you want to do with your life. I nodded slowly, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate precision. They're not wrong. The honesty of it seemed to surprise her. She blinked a couple times, her phone forgotten in her hand. Really, I said. I mean, think about it. Here I am, 32 years old, and what do I have to show for it? No steady job, no clear career path, no obvious direction. I spread my hands in a gesture of mock helplessness. I can see how that might look concerning. She smiled then, and for a second it was almost like the old Nora, the one who used to look at me like I was something precious and rare. I'm glad you can see that. I was worried you were getting defensive about it. Defensive? I shook my head. Nah. Sometimes it takes other people pointing out your blind spots before you can really see them clearly. Exactly. She reached across the counter and squeezed my hand, her engagement ring clicking against my wedding band. And the thing is, it's not too late. You could still figure out what you want to do, get some training, maybe go back to school. I could help you look into programs. That's really sweet of you, I said, and meant it. Even now, even after everything, part of me could appreciate the genuine desire to help. It was just too bad that her version of help was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I actually was. But that was okay. Misunderstandings have a way of sorting themselves out, given enough time and the right circumstances. And I had both patience and circumstances in abundance. I've actually been thinking about networking more, I said. Maybe putting myself out there, meeting people in different industries. You know, see what opportunities might be available. Her face lit up like I'd just announced I was running for president. Really? Oh my God, Michael, that's amazing. I've been hoping you'd say something like that for years. Years. She'd been hoping I'd get my act together for years, apparently. Good to know. Maybe I could even meet some of your friends' colleagues. I continued. You know, get some advice from people who are actually succeeding in their careers. Yes. She was practically bouncing on her stool now. Harper works with some really successful people, and Bianca's company is always looking for consultants. This could be perfect timing. Perfect timing indeed. I smiled and took another sip of my coffee, already mentally reviewing the files I'd been building on each of her friends. Bianca's falsified credentials, Tessa's creative expense reports, Harper's little side business of selling confidential client information, all of them employed by companies I owned through various shell corporations and investment vehicles. All of them completely unaware that the lost man they'd spent last evening mocking had the power to end their careers with a phone call. Just promise me one thing, Nora said, squeezing my hand again. What's that? Don't embarrass me, okay? I mean, I know you won't on purpose, but just try to make a good impression. These are successful people, and first impressions matter. I squeezed her hand back and gave her my most reassuring smile. Don't worry. I don't plan to embarrass anyone. Well, that wasn't entirely true. But the people I was planning to embarrass definitely had it coming. By Thursday morning, I had everything spread out across my home office like some kind of corporate crime scene. 3 manila folders, each one thick with printouts, email chains, financial records, and enough documentation to make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. The beautiful thing about building a business empire through shell corporations and blind trusts is that you get to see everything while remaining invisible yourself. Every email, every expense report, every little corner-cutting shortcut that people think nobody will ever notice. Turns out, somebody was always watching. That somebody just happened to be me. I'd started with Bianca because her case was the most straightforward. Falsified credentials are like fingerprints. Once you know what to look for, they're impossible to hide. She'd claimed to have a master's degree from the Sorbonne on her resume. complete with a fancy transcript she'd probably paid some online service to create. The problem was that the Sorbonne doesn't offer the program she claimed to have completed, and their registrar's office had no record of anyone by her name ever enrolling. I had the email correspondence to prove it, printed out in neat chronological order and paperclipped to her original job application. But wait, there was more. Bianca had also inflated her previous work experience by about 18 months, claiming to have been a senior consultant at a firm that had actually folded 6 months before her alleged start date. A simple corporate records search had revealed that little gem. The woman was basically a walking, talking monument to resume fraud, and she'd been drawing a 6-figure salary from my company for the past 2 years based on qualifications she didn't actually possess. Tessa's folder was even more interesting, in a depressing sort of way. She'd been systematically inflating her expense reports for the better part of a year, but with the kind of small-scale creativity that suggested she thought she was being clever. A $20 lunch became $35. A taxi ride across town somehow cost $60. Business dinners that definitely happened, just not at the restaurants she claimed, and definitely not at the prices she was billing. The really beautiful part was that she'd been doing it through the corporate credit card system, which meant every transaction was automatically logged and cross-referenced with merchant records. I had printouts showing the actual charges alongside her falsified reports, highlighted in yellow like a roadmap of petty theft. We were talking about maybe 15 grand total over 12 months. Not exactly embezzlement on a grand scale, but enough to constitute fraud under New York state law. Harper's case was the most egregious, and also the most personally satisfying to document. She'd been selling confidential client information to her boyfriend's competing firm for the past 8 months. Not huge secrets or anything that would tank the stock market, just enough insider knowledge to give his company a competitive edge in bidding wars and client presentations. She probably thought she was being subtle about it, but digital forensics don't lie. I had copies of her email communications, cross-referenced with her boyfriend's firm's successful proposals, showing a pattern of information sharing that was so obvious it might as well have been written in neon letters. She'd been taking photos of confidential documents with her personal phone and sending them through encrypted messaging apps, apparently unaware that our IT security protocols flagged and logged that kind of activity automatically. The irony was that she'd made maybe 5 grand from the whole operation. Pocket change compared to the lawsuits and criminal charges she'd opened herself up to. But then again, nobody ever said betrayal had to be profitable to be prosecutable. All 3 of them worked for Rev Astra Holdings, which was one of my more straightforward corporate entities. I'd founded it 6 years ago as a consulting and business development firm, and it had grown into a small but profitable operation with about 40 employees across 3 offices. The name was a combination of revelation and strategy, a little pretentious maybe, but it sounded impressive on business cards and letterhead. What none of the employees knew, including Nora's 3 friends, was that Rev Astra Holdings was wholly owned by a Luxembourg-based holding company, which was in turn controlled by a Cayman Islands trust, which ultimately traced back to me sitting in my Brooklyn apartment in my pajamas. Corporate structures are like nesting dolls when you do them right, each layer hiding the one beneath until you get to the center, where there's just one guy making all the decisions. I owned it all. Every desk, every computer, every paycheck, every coffee machine, in every break room. I was the invisible hand that guided every major decision, the silent partner who wasn't actually silent, just really good at staying in the shadows. And Nora had no idea. She'd never asked about the consulting work I claimed to do, never wondered why my schedule was so flexible or where the steady stream of income actually came from. When we'd gotten married, I'd given her a modest title at Rev Astra, Director of Strategic Communications, thinking it would be a nice way to share my success with the woman I loved. She'd been thrilled at the time, proud to have what looked like a real job with a real company. But she'd never bothered to understand what the company actually did, never showed up to any of the optional staff meetings, never engaged with the work beyond cashing her monthly paycheck. To her, it was just free money that showed up in her bank account every month, payment for a job she didn't really have to do because her husband had somehow arranged it through his mysterious network of business contacts. The consulting title had been legitimate when I'd given it to her. I genuinely hoped she'd take an interest in the business side of things, maybe even become a real partner in building something together. but she'd treated it like a charity case from day one, something her unemployed husband had managed to arrange for her out of pity or connections or dumb luck. Now, looking at her file, yes, she had a file too. I could see the pattern of neglect and disengagement stretching back over 3 years. Missed meetings, ignored emails, projects abandoned halfway through completion. She'd been drawing a salary for work she wasn't doing, taking credit for successes she hadn't contributed to, and apparently complaining to her friends about her husband's lack of ambition while cashing checks from the company he'd built from scratch. Her name was first on my list, right there at the top in black ink. Not because I wanted to hurt her more than the others, but because she was the one who'd hurt me the most. The others were just employees who'd betrayed their employer. Nora was my wife, and she'd betrayed our marriage. The difference mattered. The consequences would reflect that difference. I closed the last folder and leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the city I'd conquered without anyone noticing. Somewhere out there, for women were going about their Thursday routines, completely unaware that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. It wasn't personal. Well, okay, it was completely personal. But it was also business. And in business, actions have consequences. It was time they learned that lesson. Friday morning found me standing in front of the bathroom mirror, practicing expressions the way some people practice piano scales. Hopeful, but not desperate. Determined, but not manic. The face of a man who was finally ready to take charge of his life. Not the face of someone who was about to orchestrate the most spectacular professional downfall since Enron. Nora was still in bed, scrolling through her phone and making those little humming noises she made when she found something particularly amusing on social media. Probably more photos of other people's breakfast or inspirational quotes superimposed over sunset photographs. The mundane rituals of a life lived entirely on the surface, where depth was measured in likes and meaning came in hashtags. Hey babe, I called from the bathroom, adjusting my shirt collar for the third time. I was thinking about what you said yesterday. About networking and putting myself out there. MMM. She didn't look up from her phone, but I could hear the interest creeping into her voice. What about it? Well, I've been doing some research on professional networking events, industry meetups, that kind of thing. And I realized something. I walked back into the bedroom, buttoning my cuffs with the kind of careful precision that suggested I was taking this seriously. I've been approaching this all wrong. Now she looked up. How do you mean? I mean, I've been thinking about networking like it's this formal, intimidating thing. Like I need to walk into some corporate conference room full of strangers and try to impress them with credentials I don't have. I sat down on the edge of the bed, close enough that she could see the sincerity in my eyes. But that's not how real networking works, is it? She set down her phone, giving me her full attention for the first time in weeks. No, it's not. Real networking is about relationships, about connecting with people in natural settings. Exactly. I let a note of excitement creep into my voice, like I was having a genuine breakthrough. And I already have access to successful people through you, through your friends and their professional networks. I just need to actually engage with them instead of sitting in the corner like some kind of antisocial weirdo. Her smile was so bright it could have powered the Brooklyn Bridge. Michael, that's actually really smart. I mean, Harper knows people in finance. Bianca works with major corporate clients, and Tessa's been crushing it in her marketing role. They could definitely give you insights into what employers are looking for. That's what I was thinking, I said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. But I don't want to just ambush them at some random coffee shop or whatever. I want to do this right. Make it special. Show them that I'm serious about changing my trajectory. What did you have in mind? I paused, like the idea was just occurring to me in real time. What if we did a dinner? Somewhere nice, somewhere that shows I understand the importance of first impressions. I could treat everyone, make it a proper evening out. She blinked a few times, probably trying to reconcile this version of me with the unmotivated couch dweller she'd been mocking to her friends. That's actually a really great idea. But are you sure about the cost? I mean, dinner for 5 people at a nice restaurant. Don't worry about the money, I said, waving off her concern with the kind of casual confidence that suggested I had resources she didn't know about. I've been saving up, and this is an investment in my future. Our future. She leaned over and kissed me, soft and warm and full of something that might have been genuine affection if I didn't know better. I'm so proud of you for taking initiative like this. This is exactly the kind of thing I've been hoping you'd do. So you think the girls would be up for it? I don't want to impose on their time or anything. Are you kidding? They'll love it. Especially if you're buying. She was already reaching for her phone, fingers flying across the screen as she composed what was probably a group text. When were you thinking? Tonight, actually. I know it's short notice, but I'm feeling motivated, and I don't want to lose momentum. I stood up, pacing to the window like a man with a plan. There's this place I heard about, rooftop restaurant with great views, sophisticated atmosphere. The kind of place where serious business conversations happen. Tonight. She looked up from her phone, eyebrows raised. That's really short notice. Are you sure you can get a reservation? Leave that to me, I said, already pulling out my own phone. I've got a feeling things will work out. They would work out, of course, because I owned the building that housed the restaurant she was thinking of. The Meridian was on the top floor of one of my Manhattan properties, a sleek glass tower that had been generating solid rental income for the past 4 years. The restaurant lease was one of my more profitable arrangements, and the manager had standing instructions to accommodate any special requests from the building's ownership group, which, coincidentally, was me. I stepped into the hallway to make the call, dialing the direct number I had for Marcus, the Meridian's general manager. A soft-spoken guy in his 50s who ran the place like a Swiss watch and never asked uncomfortable questions about last-minute reservations. Mr. Reeves, he answered on the second ring, using the name on the corporate paperwork rather than my real one. What can I do for you today? I need a table for 5 tonight, Marcus. Something private, with good sightlines. And I'll need the private dining room reserved from 8 until whenever we're done. Of course, sir. Any special requirements for the evening? Just the usual discretion. And if anyone asks how we managed to get a reservation on such short notice, the story is that we're friends of a friend. Nothing more specific than that. Understood. I'll have everything prepared. Will you be requiring the sommelier's recommendations? That would be perfect. Nothing too flashy, but make sure it's impressive enough to suggest that whoever. The Meridian's private dining room was exactly what I'd hoped for. Elegant without being ostentatious. Intimate without feeling cramped. And positioned with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of Manhattan's glittering skyline. The kind of room where important decisions got made and careers were built or destroyed, depending on who was holding the cards. Tonight, I was holding all the cards. They just didn't know it yet. I'd arrived 30 minutes early to ensure everything was perfect. Marcus had outdone himself with the setup. Crisp white linens, gleaming silverware, fresh orchids as centerpieces, and wine glasses that caught the light just right. The kind of attention to detail that suggested serious money and serious connections. Exactly the impression I wanted to create. Nora arrived with her entourage at 8:15, fashionably late in the way that successful people are supposed to be. She looked stunning in a black cocktail dress I'd never seen before, probably bought specifically for tonight, probably charged to the credit card linked to her Rev Astra Holdings salary. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh out loud. Harper made her entrance like she was walking a red carpet, silver heels clicking against the polished floor with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her own importance. Her dress was designer. I could tell from the way the fabric fell and the subtle logo near the neckline. Probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, definitely more than someone in her position should have been able to afford on a legitimate salary. Tessa followed close behind. Blonde hair perfectly styled, and makeup applied with the precision of someone who'd spent at least an hour getting ready. She was wearing red lipstick that matched her clutch purse, and she kept smoothing her dress like she was nervous about making the right impression, which was sweet, in a way, since she had no idea what kind of impression she was about to make. Bianca brought up the rear, and I had to admit she'd committed fully to the performance. Tonight's version of her fake French accent was dialed up to 11. And she was wearing what looked like an authentic Chanel suit, black wool with gold buttons and trim that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Either she was living way beyond her means, or she'd gotten very creative with her expense account receipts. Michael, Nora practically glowed as she introduced me around the table. Ladies, you remember my husband. And Michael, you know everyone. But let me do proper introductions. I stood up, straightening my tie with just the right amount of nervous energy. Tonight, I was playing the role of hopeful husband, the guy who was finally ready to step up and make something of himself. It was important to get the performance exactly right. Harper, this is Michael. Harper works in investment consulting for Meridian Financial. Harper extended a perfectly manicured hand, her smile bright and professional. So nice to meet you properly, Michael. Nora's told us so much about you. I'll bet she has, I thought, but kept my expression warm and grateful. All good things, I hope. Of course, her laugh was like champagne bubbles, light, sparkling, and ultimately empty. She says you're finally ready to get serious about your career. That's so exciting. Tessa handles marketing and brand strategy for Morrison & Associates. Nora continued, and Tessa stepped forward with the kind of smile that suggested she'd been practicing it in mirrors. I love meeting people who are at crossroads in their careers, Tessa said, shaking my hand with just a little too much enthusiasm. There's something so inspiring about someone who's brave enough to make big changes. Brave enough. Like deciding to stop being a professional disappointment required the same kind of courage as scaling Everest or fighting fires. But I nodded appreciatively, like her words meant something profound. And this is Bianca. She's in client relations for Sterling Communications. Enchante, Bianca said, offering her hand with the kind of theatrical flourish that belonged in a 1940s movie. It is so wonderful to finally meet Z-Man behind Z Mystery Non. The fake accent was even worse in person than it had sounded through the walls of my apartment. Every word dripped with manufactured sophistication, like she was constantly auditioning for the role of European sophisticate in a community theater production. The mystery? I asked, allowing just a hint of confusion to creep into my voice. Well, you are always so, how do you say, elusive when we visit Nora. Like a shadow, very quiet, very mysterious. She gestured with her wine glass in a way that was probably meant to look elegant, but mostly looked pretentious. But tonight, here you are, taking charge. C'est magnifique. We settled around the table, and I made sure to position myself where I could see everyone's faces clearly. The wine Marcus had selected was perfect, a Bordeaux that was expensive enough to impress, but not so rare that it would raise questions about how I'd managed to afford it. I let Harper order first, then followed her lead in a way that suggested I was learning from her expertise. So Michael, Bianca said once we'd all placed our orders, Nora tells us you are ready to, comment did on, reinvent yourself professionally? Something like that, I said, taking a sip of wine and letting a moment of what looked like vulnerability pass across my face. I guess I've been coasting for a while, you know? Telling myself I was figuring things out, but really just avoiding the hard work of actually building something meaningful. The three of them exchanged glances, quick, subtle looks that said they'd definitely discussed my shortcomings in detail. Probably multiple times. Probably with great amusement. That's so honest, Tessa said, leaning forward. That's so honest, Tessa said, leaning forward with the expression of someone who thought she was being encouraging. Most people aren't willing to admit when they've been spinning their wheels. Well, it's hard to ignore the evidence forever, I said with a self-deprecating laugh. Especially when your wife's friends are all crushing it in their careers while you're sitting at home reading philosophy books and pretending that counts as productivity. More glances. More of that barely concealed amusement. Harper actually bit her lip to keep from smiling too broadly. But philosophy can be valuable, Harper said, in the tone of someone trying very hard to be charitable. I mean, critical thinking skills are important in any field. Sure, but at some point you have to apply those skills to something concrete, right? Something that actually generates value for other people. I gestured around the table. You three have figured that out. You've built careers that matter, that contribute to something bigger than yourselves. It wasn't easy, Bianca said, straightening in her chair with obvious pride. I had to work very hard to get where I am today. Many years of education, many sacrifices. Many years of fabricated education, she meant. Many sacrifices of honesty and integrity. But I nodded respectfully, like I was genuinely impressed by her dedication. What was your path like? I asked. I mean, how did you know you wanted to go into client relations? She launched into what was obviously a well-rehearsed story about discovering her passion for international business during her fictional semester at the Sorbonne, complete with anecdotes about inspiring professors and life-changing conversations with fellow students. I listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking follow-up questions that showed I was taking notes for my own potential career pivot. Tessa shared her own success story, full of strategic networking and bold career moves that had led to her current position. She was more honest than Bianca. Her resume was mostly legitimate, as far as I could tell, but she couldn't resist embellishing the details to make herself sound more impressive. Every project became a major victory. Every client presentation became a masterclass in persuasion. Harper was the most subtle in her self-promotion, but also the most revealing. She talked about the importance of having access to information, about building relationships with people who could provide insights that others didn't have. She made it sound like sophisticated networking, but I could hear the subtext clearly enough. She was describing the foundation of her little insider trading operation without realizing it. The key, Harper said, gesturing with her fork in a way that suggested she was sharing hard-won wisdom, is understanding that information is currency. The more you know about what's really happening in your industry, the better positioned you are to make smart decisions. That makes sense, I said. But how do you get access to that kind of information when you're starting from scratch? I mean, I don't exactly have a network of industry contacts. You start small, she said, warming to her theme. You find people who are willing to share insights, and you make sure to return the favor when you can. It's all about building mutually beneficial relationships. Mutually beneficial relationships, like the one she had with her boyfriend, where she provided confidential client information in exchange for cash payments. Beautiful. What about you, Michael? Tessa asked, apparently deciding it was time to turn the spotlight back on me. What kind of field are you thinking about getting into? I mean, what actually interests you? This was the moment I'd been building toward all evening. I set down my wine glass and looked around the table, meeting each of their eyes with the expression of someone who was about to reveal something important about himself. Honestly, I've always been fascinated by how organizations really work. Not the stuff you see in mission statements and corporate websites, but the actual mechanics of how decisions get made, how power flows through systems, how individual actions ripple outward to affect entire companies. I paused, letting that sink in. I guess you could say I'm interested in accountability. Accountability? Bianca raised an eyebrow. In what sense? Making sure that people's actions align with their stated values. That there are consequences when they don't. I smiled, letting just a hint of something sharper show through the affable exterior. I think there's tremendous value in helping organizations identify discrepancies between what they say they stand for and what they actually do. The conversation continued for another hour, but I could tell I'd planted a seed of something. Curiosity, maybe, or unease. They couldn't quite figure out what to make of my sudden transformation from aimless dreamer to focused professional, but they were clearly intrigued. Finally, as we were finishing dessert, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out 4 manila envelopes, each one elegantly sealed and labeled with a name written in gold ink. Before we wrap up, I said, standing up with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone stop talking, I wanted to give each of you something. A small token of my appreciation for taking the time to share your insights with me tonight. The first envelope landed in front of Bianca with the soft whisper of expensive paper against white linen. Her name was written across the front in elegant gold script, the kind of calligraphy you'd expect on wedding invitations or high-end corporate communications. She picked it up with the same theatrical delicacy she applied to everything else, turning it over in her hands like she was examining a piece of fine art. "Oh, Michael," she said, that fake accent purring with pleasure. "You did not ave to." "Please," I said, raising a hand to stop her. "Open it first. Then we can talk." The second envelope went to Tessa, who immediately started giggling in that nervous way people do when they're not sure if they're about to receive good news or bad news. She held it up to the light as if she could divine its contents through the paper, then set it down on the table with the careful precision of someone handling a potential explosive device. Harper got the third envelope, and I could see her analytical mind already working as she weighed it in her hands. She was probably calculating the paper stock, the printing costs, the implications of someone who supposedly had no job suddenly producing professional quality correspondence materials. But she was smiling, so she was clearly filing it under pleasant surprise rather than cause for concern. The fourth envelope I kept in my hand, fingers drumming against it in what I hoped looked like nervous energy rather than barely contained anticipation. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The revelation that would transform this cozy dinner party into something none of them would ever forget. "What is it?" Nora asked, leaning forward with the kind of excited curiosity that suggested she thought I'd prepared some kind of heartfelt thank you notes. Maybe poetry about professional inspiration, or handwritten promises to be a better husband and citizen. "Just open them," I said, settling back into my chair with the calm confidence of someone who'd already won a game nobody else realized they were playing. "All of you, at the same time." They looked at each other with the kind of conspiratorial amusement that women share when they think they're about to indulge a man's slightly ridiculous gesture. Bianca actually rolled her eyes in a way that was probably meant to be charming, like she was dealing with an overeager puppy who'd brought her a stick. "On three," Harper suggested, and the others nodded. "1, 2, 3. The sound of 4 envelopes being opened simultaneously was oddly satisfying. A soft chorus of tearing paper that reminded me of Christmas morning. If Christmas morning involved the systematic destruction of people's carefully constructed lives. Bianca was the first to extract the contents of her envelope, unfolding what was clearly a formal business letter with the kind of heavy paper stock that suggested serious institutional weight. She started reading with that same theatrical smile, but I could see the exact moment when the words began to register. Her eyebrows drew together in confusion, then shot up in alarm, and finally settled into something approaching horror. "What?" she started to say, but the words died in her throat as she kept reading. Tessa had gone completely silent, her face cycling through the same progression of emotions, but in fast forward. The nervous giggling had stopped abruptly, replaced by the kind of stillness that comes over animals when they realize they're being hunted. Harper was the quickest reader of the three, and also the first to look up at me with genuine understanding in her eyes. Not fear yet, that would come in a moment, but the dawning realization that she'd seriously misjudged the situation she'd walked into. Effective immediately, Harper read aloud, her voice carefully controlled, but with a slight tremor that suggested she was working hard to maintain her composure. "Your employment with Revastra Holdings is terminated due to breach of confidentiality agreements and ethical violations as outlined in the attached documentation." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Bianca's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and Tessa was staring at her letter like it was written in a foreign language she couldn't quite translate. "I don't understand," Tessa whispered, finally looking up from the page. This says I've been terminated for expense account fraud. But that's impossible. I mean, I work for Morrison and Associates, not." She checked the letterhead again. "Not Revastra Holdings." "Actually, you don't," I said, my voice gentle but implacable. Morrison and Associates is a wholly owned subsidiary of Sterling Communications, which is itself controlled by Revastra Holdings through a series of corporate partnerships and acquisition agreements. Has been for the past 18 months. You all work for the same company, ultimately. You all work for me. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the soft hum of the restaurant's air conditioning system, the distant clink of glasses from the main dining room, the almost imperceptible whisper of traffic from the street 40 floors below. "That's not possible," Bianca said, but her voice had lost all of its artificial European sophistication. She sounded like what she actually was, a scared woman from New Jersey who'd built her entire professional identity on a foundation of lies that was now crumbling beneath her feet. "Your resume indicates you have a master's degree from the Sorbonne," I continued, pulling out my own copy of her termination letter and the supporting documentation. Specifically, an MBA in International Business Administration, completed in 2019. Unfortunately, the Sorbonne doesn't offer that program. Never has. Their registrar's office confirms they have no record of you ever enrolling in any program. Bianca's mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out, like a fish gasping for air. "Tessa, your expense reports show a fascinating pattern of inflation over the past 12 months. Lunches that cost $20 somehow became $35 on your reimbursement requests. Taxi rides across town that should have been $15 were billed at $60. It's all documented, cross-referenced with actual merchant records and credit card statements." Tessa had started crying. Not the dramatic sobbing you see in movies, but the quiet, desperate tears of someone watching their entire life collapse in real time. "And Harper, I turned to the woman who'd been selling confidential information to her boyfriend's firm with such casual arrogance. Your digital communications are particularly interesting. 8 months of forwarding client proposals, strategic documents, and competitive intelligence to unauthorized recipients. All logged, all traceable, all completely illegal under both your employment contract and New York state law. Harper was the only one who hadn't completely fallen apart yet. She was staring at me with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she was still trying to find an angle, still looking for a way to talk her way out of this. "Who are you?" she asked, and there was something almost respectful in her voice. Like she'd finally realized she was dealing with a different class of opponent than she'd expected. I reached for the fourth envelope, the one with Nora's name written in the same gold script, and placed it gently on the table in front of my wife. She'd been sitting in stunned silence through the entire revelation, but now she was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, not even confusion. Something deeper and more complex, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time in 5 years of marriage. "Open it," I said softly. She did, with the mechanical precision of someone operating on autopilot. Inside was her own termination letter, along with a detailed breakdown of her employment history with Revastra Holdings, or rather, her complete lack of actual employment despite 3 years of regular paychecks. "But I don't work for Revastra Holdings," she said, looking up at me with something that might have been relief. "I mean, not really. That was just that consulting thing you arranged for me. It wasn't a real job." Director of Strategic Communications, I read from her file. Salary of $8,000 per month, plus benefits, plus quarterly bonuses tied to company performance. Sounds pretty real to me. But I never did anything. I never went to meetings or completed projects or... No, I agreed. "You didn't. You collected paychecks for work you never performed, took credit for successes you didn't contribute to, and apparently used your position as a platform to mock the man who made it all possible." I stood up again, straightening my jacket with the same careful precision I'd used all evening. But now it wasn't nervous energy. It was the gesture of someone who'd just completed a very complex and very successful business transaction. "The company's seal," I said, pointing to the bottom of each letter where the official Revastra Holdings logo was embossed in gold foil, "represents the authority of the company's board of directors." And the signature below that. I paused, letting them all look more closely at the name printed beneath the elaborate signature line. "Belongs to the company's founder, chief executive officer, and primary shareholder, Michael Revastra," Harper read aloud, the pieces finally clicking into place in her analytical mind. "That's right," I said. "Michael Revastra, not Michael Johnson, unemployed philosophy enthusiast and professional disappointment. Michael Revastra, who built a multi-million-dollar consulting empire from scratch, who owns the building we're sitting in right now, and who just spent the most educational evening of his life learning exactly what his wife and her friends really think of him." The revelation hit the table like a physical force. I could see it in their faces, the moment when everything they thought they knew about reality suddenly rearranged itself into a completely different picture. Nora was staring at me like I'd just removed a mask to reveal that I was actually an alien life form. Which, in a way, I suppose I had. I made it exactly 7 steps toward the elevator before Nora's voice cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a knife through silk. Michael, wait." The desperation in her voice might have stopped me 6 months ago, might have triggered that automatic husband reflex to turn around and fix whatever was broken, to smooth over whatever had gone wrong. But that was before I'd heard her laugh at my expense in our own living room. That was before I'd learned that the woman I'd loved for 5 years saw me as nothing more than an elaborate disappointment with a flexible schedule. I kept walking. Her heels clicked frantically against the polished floor as she caught up to me in the hallway outside the private dining room. The sound echoed off the walls with the sharp staccato rhythm of panic, of someone who'd just realized that everything they thought they understood about their life had been an illusion. "You lied to me," she said, grabbing my arm with both hands like she was trying to anchor herself to something solid in a world that had suddenly started shifting beneath her feet. I stopped then, not because her grip was strong enough to hold me, but because some conversations need to happen in person. Some truths require eye contact to be fully delivered. I turned to face her, And for a moment I was struck by how beautiful she still was, even with her makeup slightly smudged and her carefully styled hair beginning to come undone. Even with the desperate edge of realization making her voice crack. "No," I said, keeping my voice level and calm. "I didn't lie to you, Nora. I just never corrected your assumptions. That's the same thing." Her voice had risen enough that a couple walking past the elevators glanced over with the kind of uncomfortable curiosity that people display when they accidentally witness someone else's private drama unfolding in public. "Is it?" I pulled my arm free from her grip, not roughly, but with enough firmness to make it clear that the conversation was happening on my terms now. "When did you ever ask me what I actually did for work? When did you ever show the slightest interest in where our money came from or how I managed to pay for this apartment, our trips, your car, your shopping habits?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently realizing that she didn't have a good answer to that question. "You created a story about who I was based on." "What exactly? The fact that I worked from home? The fact that I didn't wear a suit to an office every morning? The fact that I had time to make you breakfast and pick up your dry cleaning?" I shook my head, feeling a kind of weary amusement at the absurdity of it all. "You decided I was a failure, and then you never bothered to question that decision. But you let me think. I let you think what you wanted to think. There's a difference." I stepped closer to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Did you ever wonder how I could afford to take you to Paris for your birthday? Did you ever question where the money came from for your engagement ring, or the down payment on our apartment, or that ridiculous designer handbag you bought last month? I thought you had some kind of trust fund, or inheritance, or you thought I was living off family money." I couldn't keep the bitter edge out of my voice. "You thought I was some kind of rich kid coasting on his parents' success while you suffered through the indignity of being married to a man without ambition. That's not." She stopped, apparently realizing that it was exactly what she'd thought. "You planned this," she said suddenly, and I could see her trying to work through the implications in real time. "Tonight, this dinner, those letters. You planned all of this." "No," I said, and I meant it. "You planned this. When you invited your friends over to our apartment and turned me into the punchline of your evening's entertainment. When you let them mock me in my own home while I stood there invisible, holding dessert I'd bought for a woman who apparently thought I was some kind of charity case she'd picked up off the street." The words hit her like physical blows. I could see her flinch with each one, could see the exact moment when she realized that I'd heard everything. Not just the general mockery, but the specific details, the casual cruelty, the way they'd all laughed at the idea of my having goals or ambitions or any kind of meaningful future. "I didn't know you were there," she whispered. "That's the problem, Nora. You never knew I was anywhere. You never looked hard enough to see me, never cared enough to ask the right questions, never bothered to figure out who you'd actually married." I straightened my tie, a gesture that had become automatic over the course of the evening. "You married a fantasy, your version of me, not the actual me. And when that fantasy didn't live up to your expectations, you decided the problem was with reality instead of with your perception of it. So this is your revenge." Her voice was getting stronger now, anger beginning to replace the shock and confusion. "You destroy my friends' careers. You humiliate me in public. You blow up our entire life together because your feelings got hurt." "My feelings?" I almost laughed. "Nora, this isn't about my feelings. This is about consequences. Your friends committed fraud, theft, and breach of contract while working for companies I own. What happened to them tonight would have happened eventually regardless, because you can't build a career on a foundation of lies and expect it to last forever. And me? What about what you did to me? What did I do to you exactly? I gave you a job you never wanted to do, paid you a salary for work you never performed, and supported a lifestyle you never questioned until the source of that support became inconvenient." I paused, studying her face in the dim hallway lighting. "The only thing I did wrong was not telling you the truth from the beginning. But honestly, I don't think you would have believed it even if I had." She was crying now, but quietly, the kind of tears that come when anger and hurt and confusion all try to express themselves simultaneously. "So what happens now? What happens to us?" "I don't know," I said, and it was the first completely honest thing I'd said to her in months. "That depends on whether you're capable of seeing me as I actually am, or whether you're going to keep insisting that I be the person you thought I was." I don't even know who you actually are anymore. That's the thing, Nora. You never did. You just thought you did, and you never cared enough to find out if you were right. I turned back toward the elevators, but her voice stopped me one more time. You said you loved me. I looked back at her, standing there in the hallway of a building I owned, wearing a dress probably bought with money from a company I'd built, crying over the collapse of a marriage based on fundamental misunderstandings that she'd never bothered to correct. I did love you, I said. I loved the woman I thought you were. The woman who would have been curious about her husband's work, who would have asked questions instead of making assumptions, who would have trusted me enough to know that if I was keeping secrets, there might be good reasons for it. And now I know that woman never existed. She was my fantasy, just like unemployed philosopher Michael was yours. The difference is that I'm capable of dealing with reality when it doesn't match my expectations. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and the doors slid open to reveal an empty car lined with mirrors that reflected the hallway scene back. The car ride back to Brooklyn gave me 45 minutes to think, which turned out to be exactly 44 minutes too long. By the time we pulled up in front of the brownstone, I'd cycled through every possible emotion: satisfaction, regret, anger, sadness, relief, and landed somewhere in the vicinity of exhausted acceptance. The kind of bone-deep weariness that comes when you finally stop carrying a weight you didn't realize had been crushing you. The driver helped me out with the kind of professional courtesy that expensive car services train their employees to provide, and I tipped him well, because the night had been profitable enough that I could afford to spread the wealth around. He drove off into the maze of Brooklyn streets, probably heading back to Manhattan to pick up another businessman whose evening had gone either much better or much worse than mine. Our front steps still creaked. I'd never gotten around to fixing them, despite having more than enough money to hire someone to replace the entire staircase if I wanted to. Some things you just get used to, I suppose. The familiar sound was almost comforting after an evening of revelations and confrontations, a small piece of continuity in a world that had just been fundamentally rearranged. The apartment felt different when I walked in. Not physically, everything was exactly where. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting in the exact same spot where Nora had held court that night, perched on the armrest of our couch, legs crossed, wine glass in hand. But instead of an audience of sycophantic friends, I had only silence for company. The kind of deep, comfortable silence that comes when you finally stop pretending to be someone you're not. The apartment felt different now, larger, somehow, like removing the weight of unspoken truths had created more physical space. The morning light streamed through windows that Nora used to complain were too small, illuminating rooms that she'd always said felt cramped, but that now seemed exactly the right size for a man who'd finally learned to take up the amount of space he actually occupied in the world. She'd moved out 2 weeks ago, not in anger, and not with drama, but with the kind of quiet resolve that comes when two people finally admit that they've been trying to force incompatible puzzle pieces together for years. The conversation had been surprisingly civil, almost businesslike in its efficiency. Division of assets, forwarding addresses, arrangements for picking up mail. The practical dissolution of a life built on impractical assumptions. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be the person I think you want me to be, she'd said the morning she packed her suitcase. And you need to figure out whether you can trust someone enough to let them see who you really are from the beginning. She wasn't wrong. Trust, it turned out, was a much more complicated thing than I'd realized. I'd thought I was protecting her by keeping my success secret, but really I'd been protecting myself. Protecting myself from the possibility that she might not love the real me as much as she loved the project version. Protecting myself from having to be vulnerable with someone who might not be capable of handling that vulnerability responsibly. The irony was that by trying to protect us both, I'd guaranteed that neither of us got what we actually needed. My phone buzzed against the coffee table, the same coffee table where I'd once found scattered wine glasses and the detritus of an evening spent mocking my supposed failures. These days, it held nothing but my laptop, a cup of coffee that was actually still hot, and the morning newspaper that I'd started reading again now that my mornings weren't consumed with the elaborate performance of being someone I wasn't. The text was from Harper, of all people. Just a short message. Coffee sometime? I owe you an apology. I stared at the message for a long moment, trying to decide how I felt about it. Harper had been the first of Nora's friends to reach out after the dinner, Probably because she was the only one with enough professional sophistication to understand what had actually happened that night. The others were still probably figuring out how to explain their sudden unemployment to family and friends. But Harper had immediately hired a lawyer, started working on a settlement agreement, and begun the process of rebuilding her career on a foundation that didn't involve selling confidential information to competing firms. I texted back, "Gramercy coffee. Tuesday, 2 p.m. Her response came back almost immediately, "Thank you." The funny thing was, I wasn't entirely sure why I'd agreed to meet her. It wasn't forgiveness. What she'd done was too calculated and too damaging for simple forgiveness. And it wasn't business. She'd already signed all the legal documents necessary to resolve her employment termination without further complications. Maybe it was just curiosity about what kind of apology someone constructs when they've been caught red-handed betraying the trust of an employer they didn't know they had. Or maybe it was something simpler than that. Maybe it was the recognition that people were more complicated than their worst decisions, and that understanding those complications was more interesting than just writing them off as irredeemable. The coffee in my cup had finally reached the perfect temperature, hot enough to be satisfying, cool enough to drink without burning your tongue. Small pleasures, the kind you notice when you're not spending all your mental energy maintaining elaborate deceptions. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed the simple ritual of drinking coffee while reading the news, without having to worry about what performance I needed to give when Nora woke up. Not that I was bitter about the performances. They'd served their purpose for a while, and they taught me things about myself that I probably wouldn't have learned any other way. Like how exhausting it is to pretend to be less than you are. Like how corrosive it is to your sense of self when you let other people's limited imaginations define your possibilities. Like how much you can love someone and still not really know them at all. The newspaper was full of the usual mix of political scandals, economic indicators, and human interest stories that made up the daily background noise of civilization trying to figure itself out. But tucked away on page 6 of the business section was a small article that made me smile. Local consulting firm announces expansion. The piece was barely 3 paragraphs long, just a brief note that Revastra Holdings had acquired 2 new subsidiary companies and was planning to open offices in Boston and Philadelphia over the next 6 months. Standard business news, the kind of thing that only got noticed by people who were already paying attention to the consulting industry. But seeing my company's name in print, knowing that the work I'd been doing in relative obscurity was solid enough to merit expansion, gave me a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication or proving anyone wrong. It was just the satisfaction of building something worth building. My laptop chimed with an email notification, probably Marcus confirming the details for next week's board meeting, or maybe the Philadelphia real estate agent with updates on potential office spaces. I'd gotten back into the habit of checking email first thing in the morning, now that I didn't have to pretend that my professional life was some kind of embarrassing secret. But when I opened the laptop, the new message wasn't from Marcus or the real estate agent. It was from an address I didn't recognize, with a subject line that said simply, "Thank you." I almost deleted it, probably spam, or maybe some kind of phishing attempt. But something about the stark simplicity of it made me curious enough to click it open. "Mr. Revastra," it began. "You don't know me, but I work for one of your subsidiary companies. I heard through the office grapevine about what happened with some employees who were terminated for ethical violations, and I wanted you to know that those of us who do our jobs honestly appreciate that there are consequences for people who don't. It's easy to feel like cheating pays off when you see people getting ahead through shortcuts and deception. It's good to know that someone is paying attention and that eventually, actions have consequences. Thank you for creating a place where integrity matters." It was signed simply a grateful employee. I read it twice, then leaned back against the couch cushions and tried to process the fact that my little dramatic revelation dinner had apparently sent ripples through the corporate ecosystem in ways I hadn't anticipated. Of course it had. News travels fast in professional circles, especially news about spectacular firings for cause. But I hadn't really thought about how it might affect the people who were doing their jobs honestly, who were following the rules and playing fair, and probably wondering sometimes whether any of that mattered. Apparently, it did matter. Apparently, there were people who noticed when integrity was rewarded and dishonesty was punished. Apparently, the choice to hold people accountable for their actions had consequences that extended beyond just the people being held accountable. It was a good reminder that the systems we build, corporate structures, marriage contracts, family relationships, friendships, don't exist in isolation. They're all connected, all influencing each other in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes not. When you let people get away with betraying trust, you're not just enabling their behavior. You're sending a message to everyone else about what kinds of standards actually matter. When you finally decide to enforce those standards, you're not just punishing the people who violated them. You're affirming the value of the people who've been following them all along. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Michael. The voice was tentative, familiar, but strained. It's Bianca. I sat up straighter, suddenly more alert. Of all of Nora's friends, Bianca was the last one I'd expected to hear from. Her fraud had been the most egregious, her lies the most elaborate, her entire professional identity the most fundamentally dishonest. Bianca, this is unexpected. I know, and I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to. I needed to tell you something. I waited, not sure what kind of conversation this was going to turn into. I never thanked you, she said, and there was something different about her voice. The fake accent was completely gone, replaced by what sounded like a New Jersey native trying to figure out how to be honest for the first time in years. Thank me for what? Getting you fired? For stopping me? She paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. I've been lying about who I am for so long that I'd started to believe my own stories. The fake degree, the fake accent, the fake sophistication. I'd built this whole identity that wasn't real, and I was so committed to maintaining it that I couldn't see how much it was costing me. And now I'm in therapy, trying to figure out who I actually am underneath all the pretense. It's terrifying, but it's also liberating, I guess. I don't have to remember which lies I've told to which people anymore. I don't have to keep track of fake accomplishments or worry about someone checking my references too carefully. I found myself genuinely curious about what came next for her. What are you going to do professionally? I'm going back to school. For real this time. Getting a degree in something I'm actually interested in instead of something that sounds impressive on a resume. Another pause. I wanted to apologize for what I said about you that night. At Nora's. You didn't deserve that, and I'm sorry I participated in it. Apology accepted, I said, and meant it. There's one more thing. I wanted you to know that what you did, holding us accountable, it wasn't cruel. It felt cruel at the time, but it wasn't. It was necessary. I needed someone to force me to stop living a lie before I completely lost track of who I really was. After she hung up, I sat in the quiet apartment for a long time, thinking about the strange ways that endings and beginnings can get tangled up together. 3 weeks ago, I'd thought I was orchestrating an ending. The end of my marriage's foundation of deception, the end of Nora's friends' careers built on fraud, the end of my own willingness to hide who I really was. But apparently, I'd also been creating beginnings. Bianca's journey toward authenticity. Harper's opportunity to rebuild her career on honest foundations. That anonymous employee's renewed faith that integrity mattered. My own chance to figure out whether I could build relationships based on truth instead of convenient fictions. Even Nora's beginning, whatever that might turn out to be. The morning sun had shifted position while I'd been lost in thought, and now it was streaming directly through the window onto the spot where I was sitting. Warm and bright and honest. The kind of light that doesn't hide anything or create false shadows. The kind of light that shows things exactly as they are. I finished my coffee, closed the laptop, and got ready to start another day of being exactly who I was. No more, no less, and no apologies for either. It was, I had to admit, a pretty good way to live.